Well, the church is an amazing and fascinating beast, isn't it? It is. It truly, I don't mean that sarcastically. I mean, it actually is a fascinating thing. When we consider how we think about church, what we describe church as, when we think about what it feels like, what it is in our lives, it's an amazing thing. It has so many different parts, so many different pieces, all of which are, of course, connected. But we often look at church in very different ways. For example, is the church the people? Is the church a building? Is it an action, doing church? Is it, Sunday morning? Is it our particular denomination? Or when we say church, are we talking about the church universal? Right? What church is for everybody. There's so many different ways of looking at it. And that's a particularly interesting thing for the United Church, I think, because the United Church it has so many unique properties to it. One of which, like most progressive churches, of course, the United Church is often criticized for having no theology. People, particularly in other denominations that are much more orthodox, they look at the United Church and go, well, what is it that you guys believe? And if someone were to ask you, as a member of the United Church, what do you believe? What is your theology? What are you going to say? How are you going to answer that? Are you going to answer that right away? And see, I, of course, because it's me, would immediately answer that with, well, what do you mean by theology exactly? But even if you just answer that with what you believe, are you going to answer what you believe? Or are you going to answer what you think the church as a whole believes? I mean, we have articles of faith. We have the Articles of Union, right? I'm sure we all know those by heart. We also have various statements of faith. Through the years, we've made various statements of faith. We have a creed. In fact, the new creed is one of the things that internationally the United Church is quite famous for, because it is such a unique, new, and progressive way of describing what we believe. And I'm sure we've all memorized the creed, of course, because when you become a member of the United Church, you're, of course, required to recite all of those things from memory. You're not, actually. In fact, as a minister, you are not required to recite those things from memory. If you wanted, for instance, become a pastor in the Lutheran Church or the Roman Catholic Church, you need to know the Articles of Faith, whatever term they use to describe them, and the various creeds from memory. You're literally required to know that. In the United Church, they ask you two questions to become a minister. One is, will you be part of the pension plan? But the other, the important one is, are you in essential agreement with the Articles of Union? And by essential agreement, of course, we mean, can you take this thing that was written in 1925, in language of 1925, with the thinking of 1925, and understand that in a way that is meaningful to you today? That's essentially what essential agreement means. But in other denominations, you're required to know various catechisms and creeds and all sorts of important stuff like that, even just to be a member. And a lot of people will say, that's a really good thing because it helps define who you are. Except does it? Or does it define your institution for you? Whether that's what you necessarily believe or not. Here's the thing. When you become a member of the United Church of Canada, we, I'm sorry to use the word again, but essentially, we will ask you three questions. They are three questions that are worded in very different ways in different places, but essentially the three questions are this. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in and follow Jesus, the way of Jesus? And the third question is, are you prepared to share that with us as a community that you are joining and the world at large? That's the three questions. Do you believe in God? Do you follow Jesus? Are you prepared to share that? Think about that for a second, because that's particularly relevant to today, and it's kind of the thing that I want to talk about as a way of connecting to what I was just talking about the church as an institution. Because today's Trinity Sunday, and the Trinity is a big deal in most Christian churches. There are some denominations of the Christian faith, by the way, that do not uphold the Trinity as a doctrine. But the United Church still does. That most mainline churches do. In fact, it's a key piece of our theology as an institution, as an institutionalized church. It's important to remember that, because I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But it's a key piece of things. And the real question then becomes, what is the Trinity? Well, that is a very good question, because quite often we have referred to the Trinity as one of the great mysteries of the faith. There are many, and depending on how you think of things, there are more. But there are many. The Trinity is a key piece, though, because the Trinity is essentially, I'm using that word again. The Trinity is essentially trying to explain that God, the one God, is three persons, which we have variously described historically as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. There's a variety of language that we use around that, depending on how far you're allowed to go with it. I'll come back to that in a second too. But essentially, it describes how God can be God and three persons at the same time. Three persons who are unique and individual, and yet share the same nature or essence. So that wording might sound a little bit sort of fluffy and fussy, which it is, and it's intended to be, because part of the problem with explaining the Trinity is you can't. The reason we have it in the first place is because, and by the way, the word Trinity doesn't appear in the Bible, ever, anywhere. We made it up. In fact, the word Trinity doesn't appear anywhere until about the 3rd or 4th century. But we made it up because Trinity, tri is three, unity, one, right? 3 and 1, 1 and 3, that's the Trinity. We made it up because in the early days of the church, inheritors of the Jewish tradition, right? The first followers of Jesus, like Jesus, were Jews. But we inherited a tradition of one God. There is one God. And yet, our stories are about Jesus, the one who was promised, the Son of God, the Word made flesh, Emmanuel, God with us, the Son of God, and the Holy Spirit, the power of God at work in the world, the Spirit of truth, or what I like to say is, in order that we don't limit it, the Spirit of all that is true. We have those other pieces, and we have our faith tradition comes from those pieces. So how do you reconcile the idea that there is one God, and yet God appears historically in our tradition as creator, but also in human form as Jesus, divine and human, and the power of God at work in the world, the Spirit? How do you reconcile those things? So they came up with this idea of explaining it. And that's why it's a doctrine, by the way. Doctrine is simply, and this is the difference between doctrine and dogma. You might hear that word too. Doctrine is a teaching of the church. It doesn't necessarily mean it's in the Bible. But doctrine means it is essentially a legalized teaching of the church. Dogma is a teaching of the church that is believed to have divine inspiration. So there's a little bit of debate around whether or not the Trinity is dogma or doctrine, or both, because dogma means it's inspired it's divinely inspired, and the idea of the Trinity actually springs from the Bible, but it is doctrine. So not all dogma is doctrine. Sorry, all dogma is doctrine. Not all doctrine is dogma. if it sounds like things are unduly complicated and fussy and I lost you about 10 minutes ago, it's okay. That's actually part of the point here. But the thing is that because it's teaching in the church, it was created to explain that, to give us some way of comprehending how we might look at the idea that God is one, and yet we have these three pieces to reconcile with each other. How are they related? Well, historically, there have been a lot of ways of trying to explain that. And in the earliest days of the church, that led to a lot of issues and a lot of people being excommunicated, because what the church did in the early days was it tried to define this, what the Trinity is. And so if you came up with an explanation of it that they didn't like, or it didn't kind of fit in, and there were lots of people who did, it was branded as heretical, and you were excommunicated. And so what happened was that the Trinity became a way, and not the only one, by the way, of creating boundaries for the new church. It started to be the way to define the institution. This is what we as Christians, and we're starting to use that word now, Christian, this is what we as Christians believe. So if you agree with that, and you know that, you're one of us. And if you don't, you're not. And we tried to define it really closely. So here's the thing about that. The result of that was that a lot of people who had questions and wondered about, well, is the relationship between God and Jesus and the Spirit, is it this? If it wasn't, that was it for you. You were out. If you believed something different, you were out. In order to be in the group, in the institution, you had to be in the box, defined by the walls that they had just built. Good fences make for good no, actually, that's not true. But the thing is, that's how things started to happen. And you can understand that. You can absolutely understand that. It was the earliest days of the new church, the new institution. You can absolutely understand that. I think we're experiencing a little bit of that in the United Church right now, in fact, because we have this new structure, right? We have this new way of being, the structure of the institutional church. We need to figure out a way to define that. The only problem with that is, when it comes to administration, that's fine. When it comes to anything beyond that, when it becomes to what you believe, when it becomes a question of what is your faith and how you understand your faith, that's a little bit more of a problem. Because, again, like most progressive churches, the United Church is less interested in your willingness to subscribe to a particular statement and more in your willingness to explore your relationship with God and Jesus and the Spirit. That's what our structure, if you like, is about. It's about allowing for you to have the opportunity to question and learn and grow with us all together. Right? That's why we say, famously, in the United Church, we don't have all the answers, but we journey with you and your questions. That's what we're about. And see, I like that. And in no way to disparage anybody else, but I like that because I think that keeps the focus where it belongs. Instead of fussing and worrying about whether or not you agree with the wall that I just built, and think about it. That's what it can easily become. It's one thing to have boundaries. I had this conversation. We're always having this conversation, I guess. But when I was at St. Andrew's College, we had somebody come and meet with the college and with students and with faculty and the board and everything to talk about where we were headed with the church and bringing people into ministry. And one of the things that came up in that conversation was how much structure we have that either keeps people out or keeps people in. And as that conversation went on, it became pretty clear, to me at least, that what we were talking about was how an institution built on the foundation that is Jesus can very quickly build walls on that foundation that in order to define us, but in doing that, we keep people out. Or we keep people in, but not because of Jesus, because there's a wall there, right? So the things that we say we believe as an institution become the things that define as not Jesus. And then the institution becomes more important than the foundation, more important than Jesus, more important than God, more important than the Holy Spirit. That's why the Trinity is such a huge piece, right? Is that it's how we connect with God. It's how we try and define God, not that you can define God. Anyway, in this conversation we were having, it became clear to me that that was the image that was happening. We had a foundation that was built on Jesus, and we were building walls. And I said in what at the time I thought was a particularly profound thing, and since I've realized that it probably actually sounded really stupid to people in the room, but it's like the shields on the Enterprise. Okay, so if you're not a Star Trek fan, the Enterprise in Star Trek, the ship, doesn't have armor like a battleship or a plane these days. Like you have protective armor, right? You try and make it as bulletproof as possible. It didn't have that kind of armor. What it had was this kind of field around it. It could generate this sort of energy field that would protect it. And the thing about that energy field is it's there in order to protect, and yet at the same time, you can see through it. You can still be aware of all that's going on around you and still feel like you're protected, because you are. And so I thought, okay, let's not talk about walls. Let's talk about how it's like the shields on the Enterprise. Our theology needs to be like that it's something that helps define us, and yet at the same time, you can see through it. Things can pass through it, right? That you want to, right? You can allow things. And more than a few people in the room thought there was something wrong with me. But I think the idea is still sound. And I think the reason I kind of went there is because it truly starts, when you start focusing on what is your theology, what is your system, what is your structure, what is your institution, it starts to be more about your institution and not what your institution was built on, which is Jesus. If we are followers of Jesus, and here's where I want to come back to the Trinity too, is that if we are followers of Jesus, if we intend to do good Jesusing in this creation of which we are part, and please, in fact, if you have a hymn book handy, you can find the New Creed pretty quickly. It's at the back. This is all in the United Church's New Creed, oddly enough. Living with respect in creation. God is with us. We are not alone. It is truly, actually, an amazing piece of work, the New Creed. We still call it the New Creed, but it was from the 60s. But what it does is, I think it does that Shields of the Enterprise thing. It gives us a way of understanding how and what we are about without cutting us off from the rest of the world. It gives us some idea of what and how we're about as we journey in exploring our faith, as we travel together, as we work on those questions that we have together, as we seek to understand what God is about, what God, Jesus, and the Spirit are about. And see, I honestly, always come back to, I think it was, and oddly enough, from the 4th century. So back in those days when we were trying to be very definitive, Augustine famously described the Trinity as lover, beloved, and love between. The focus of that understanding of the Trinity is love. the giver of love, the love that connects us and binds us all together and joins us. The example we have, the beloved, because we are all beloved of God, the example we have, Jesus, of how that love can be lived in the world, and the love itself in action, the power of that love. That's how I would connect with that. In fact, and not that I'm doing a history thing here, but when I first went into ministry, one of the things that we were asked to do is think about a creed, right? It's a statement of faith, essentially, right? A creed that you live by. And what language we would use. And we were given the various, we have many examples, right, in the Christian church, not just the new creed that we have, but also the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Creed of St. Athanasius. There's a variety of creeds. To look at that and see if we could come up with something like that. And I actually came up with something, not knowing about Augustine. Having said that, I kind of came up with something remarkably similar to that. And the person that I had to submit this to said, "Oh, hey, this is just like," and so I of course looked at it. But that's the thing. From that very era in which we were trying to be definitive, here was somebody who made a statement that was bigger, that wasn't just defining us to keep the boundaries there, but a way of showing how we are connected. That we are connected by love, and that love is in the very creation around us. It connects us to each other in that very human example that we have of Jesus, divine and human. We won't get into that argument because I'll get excommunicated for that too. But that very human expression of the divine that is Jesus, that we follow, that leads us to live, shows us to live, how to live, and leads us to live in love, and the very power itself at work, love. So however you understand the Trinity, however you look at that relationship, here's the key part to that. It's not how we define it with our language as an institution. It's the very fact that the idea of the Trinity draws to your attention relationship. How we relate to God and to each other, and the power of that relationship, how we make that relationship work. That's what it's about. And again, here it is, all coming back to love. That's what it's about. We are a community of faith by virtue of being, and by the way, that's a new language in the United Church. We don't refer to congregations anymore, or missions, or different structures, pieces of the church by its structural name anymore. We say we're all communities of faith. I like that. First of all, because it features one of the most important things to me about church, which is community, and also faith. That's what it comes down to. And so when we think about the Trinity today, let's think about our relationship with God, with each other, and how we make that relationship work. Let's think about the wonder that is creation, the mystery that is creation, and how we express that, how we were shown by Jesus how to live with love, and the very power that is love, and how we relate to that. Because ultimately, it's about relationship.